maybe some of these statements that we're going to show here speak to our participants. So as we've been talking about this perception, the way we think about the support from others, the way we receive it, changes when we become a caregiver because of others' intolerances and our recognition of that disparity. So, if one really resonates, kind of chime in on the chat. You wanted your friend to call, but the phone didn't ring. How we interpret that pre-caregiver is a lot different than we do when we are a caregiver, because our expectations are heightened. Our desire to be known and recognized is greater than ever before. And in so doing, Donna, we are more vulnerable, as what you were saying, than ever before, because we're open. Please, someone reach out. Please, someone see me. Please, someone notice and acknowledge what's happening to me and my loved one. Similarly, when I wanted family to answer my calls, they didn't. So it works both ways. We both are on the receiving end, and then when we reach out, sometimes we might interpret, and it's not just a referendum on that person picking up the phone. It's a referendum on my relationship with that person and what they mean to me in my life.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, I had a family member recently go through a very major surgery, very life-threatening surgery. And in that family, they normally were always the givers to other people. They did not know how to receive the caring of friends and family. It was really hard for them, but they had to, for the first time in their lives, be on the receiving end. Yeah. And some people who were best friends did not step forward. And that was a great big disappointment, of course. But this person in my family told me that strangers left things on her doorstep. And she said, what do I do with that? Who is this person? And maybe I want to be their friend. And maybe I'm forced to rethink some of my closest relationships that I had always depended on. I didn't even think I'd need to explain anything to the people closest to me, that they would just show up and understand automatically. And that didn't happen.
That's such a perfect example of the difference between the interpretation of an act of support. With family and friends, we can interpret all that they do and they don't do, that we wanted them to do, that we expected them to do, that we so desperately wanted them. And yet with someone who does the same act, a stranger, which we have no relational past to, we can interpret that as an act of gratitude rather than an act of deficiency. And so these are kinds of thoughts that we have we would probably very rarely ever say this to someone, Donna. These are thoughts that we would have in our mind about how we interpret and how it starts shaping the reshaping of our social support. If you've been as a caregiver and you made it to someone's house for Thanksgiving or a holiday, whatever the holiday was, you may have, and the effort it took for you to get there, and yet you couldn't find a way into the conversation, or conversations were all about people's cruises or their trips around the world, or what they were going to do in 6 months, and you found yourself excluded, not intentionally, but perceived as such, that you can't plan that far in advance. Your life is too unpredictable. You may find yourself rethinking those people and how you interpret what they're saying. And then you might convince yourself that you just don't want to burden them with what your life is, because their intolerance for negativity, as we just talked about a few minutes ago, means that we say what? We say very little, right, Donna?
Yeah, that's absolutely. So it's better just to say nothing. But then that doesn't help in terms of finding some way to connect to other people that is going to be a little bit soul satisfying. And, I just want to point out here in the chat box that people have begun, Rick and Mary are talking about how do you begin to find the words to explain these very, very complex and sometimes, emotions or thoughts and feelings that are in opposition, this ambivalence. I feel this, but at the same time, I feel that. Zachary, you and I talk a lot to each other, and we've written a lot in the book about this idea about care literacy and being able to find the words to explain first to yourself.
Yes.
Because often you have to begin with yourself and the thoughts in your head and making meaning and sense of what seems just impossible to describe. But the power in finding the right words that say, yes, that's what I mean. That is how I feel. And if you can begin to achieve that language location, and then begin to build a life story that has caring in it, instead of keeping caregiving separate. This is my real life that I'm going to go back to after my loved one dies. This is really who I am, is not now. The real me is after caregiving and before caregiving. But that's never true, because as we know, we are transformed permanently by caring for somebody we love. And so describing the here and now with words to ourselves and others is very, very important.
So well said. And so what we're even going to get to here in a few minutes is that to find that vocabulary that we talk about, that care vocabulary, we need the audience, the right audience who has tolerances for the development and flourishment of that vocabulary. And so most people think about finding the right words. We first must find the right audience to develop the right language. And so that's where we're headed right now, because I think that that's speaking to the frustration, and it's nothing personal against our pre-caregiver network, but they may be incapable of helping us develop that vocabulary.
Yeah.
To the point that oftentimes we find ourselves like the example you provided a few minutes ago, Donna, where we are maybe saying no to support from family and friends because we know there's always things that go with that support, or it's too emotionally charged, or we don't even know why we're saying no to particular outreaches of support. And it's because of some of the challenges and the limitations of receiving support from friends and family. And once again, I just want to highlight, I'm not insulting or decrying what friends and family can do for us, but in developing a care vocabulary, in finding the language to describe how this transformation from loved one to caregiver is shaping us in meaningful ways that make our life meaningful, it's important to understand what and why friends and family, beyond their names, just because of their relational history, make it sometimes difficult to be able to pull that off. And then we'll get to in a few minutes what our suggestions are to help us with that vocabulary. But you know what? Similarity is great in our pre-caregiving identity, right? Friends and family who have like experiences and are like us in so many ways, it's all good until we're thrust into a situation in which we're in a caregiving situation and no one in our family or friend network can understand, not because they don't want to, but because their experiences don't give them the kinds of tolerances that we may need to begin that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the most well-intentioned friends and family can never separate us from who we are, who we were, what they remember of us 5 years ago and 10 years ago. Oh, Donna, I know. Yeah, come on. You're always exaggerating things. You were like that as a kid, as you're trying to share with your sister or family that this is a challenge that you've never faced before. It's so ironic that family and friends are the most likely to minimize our concerns. And it's just born out of research. It's not because they're mean, even though we might feel that at times. It's because shared history encourages us to discount what someone is saying.
Yeah. It's very, every situation is so individual.
True.
But I think I don't know what you think, Zachary, or what anyone here today thinks about this, but I really feel that one of the things that makes it hard to have a conversation and hard for others to understand what it is that we're going through is that if you have never had a care experience, and you've never had like a serious care experience,
Yes.
I think that others sort of assume that if you love that person enough and you use your will, and the combination of your love and your will and your intelligence and your advocacy skills that go along with your will, you should be able to get through this just fine. You know, it should be fairly simple, because those are the things that we use to solve life's problems normally.
That's right.
And this is just not normal. Or it used to be normal. You know, I'm always very interested in speaking to people who maybe live in the country, who are older and have had a lot of experience, and they seem to absorb hardship and illness and life and death, having babies and having parents die as part of a natural cycle of life. I think in many ways our society has become disconnected from this natural cycle of life. So I think people apply these assumptions. Well, if you just try hard, if you just, like, what's the matter with you that you can't fix this?
If we think about caring as a culture, it would be as if traveling to a land in which you were open to understanding how they lived and how they made sense of their experiences. But as caregivers, we must live in two worlds, of which no one recognizes the caregiver world, but all the intolerances, like you said, of conditions. I'm powerful. I can do these things. If I have enough will, I can change things. So caregivers live in these simultaneous worlds that are incompatible at some level, because they deny each other. And over time, one must either, to care for a loved one, you must, in essence, absorb values that help you care for your loved one and for yourself.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's difficult to be able to share that with the people who might be proximally closest to you, who live as if they were in a faraway land, but they're right next to you. And so it's very disorienting. Again, well-intentioned, but disorienting. And maybe someone has an example in our chat feature here. This is an irony of life. Those who know us best most want to change our stories because they love us, Donna. They want a happy ending. They want it just, well, if you just work harder, just make it happen, just do this, and it's amazing that perhaps those who don't know us as well listen to our stories and don't feel compelled to change the story to make themselves feel better.
Right.
That's that idea of being stigmatized, that we represent as caregivers a kind of implicit stigma that we represent the fragility of life because we are near and care for someone for whom may exceed the beliefs of shaping a world of our own making outside of our care situations.
Mm-hmm.
People who care about us in our family and friend networks, pre-caregiving, are pretty loyal to who we were. And there's nothing more joyous than that, Donna, being able to step back into a friendship that you haven't talked to your dear friend in 5 years, but you can step right back into that conversation, right? But there's a perceptual shift when you recognize someone. Our friends are not really seeing us evolving anymore. It's really hard to see a dear friend changing because it becomes a kind of threat to the relationship sanctity that you've developed. If you're changing, Donna, well, then maybe you don't need or want me anymore. And I only see the fixed mindset of Donna that I knew years ago.
Yeah. That happens a lot when people have children. Yeah. And your friends who don't have kids sort of go like, oh yeah, that's so funny what your child just did. So gotta go now. And it becomes like awkward because there is this major life event that is separating you now, like a great big chasm, a great big valley between you. And to be honest, I have friends who have lost their children, and I struggle to find the words to talk to them because I haven't had that experience. And at the same time, for people who have had the experience of either, disability medical parenting or having a parent with dementia, pass away after struggling with that, I'm immediately just like this. Like, we have a million things to talk about in common already. But, I think that it might be helpful when people feel the disconnect in the family or with old friends to think of this caregiving experience as something that's very natural, for one thing, something that is inevitable in life, as Rosalind Carter said. And also, it's similar to having children or, losing a parent, that if we think of it that way, and not this big, huge aberration,
right?
Not this big, huge thing that truly nobody else has ever experienced. The fact is that there are people out there who will understand.
Of course. This is hallmarks of networks. But what we do, Donna, is we put names to them. Well, that's my brother John. How can John can't understand me? But when we think about it as a network, there's certain deficiencies and in it that certain networks can't understand because they don't have the same shared experiences. We depersonalize a little bit because it's not so charged with the fact that John should understand what's going on because he's my brother. And I so desperately want, and I expected him to. It's hard to separate that, but it's just seeing it as a network challenge rather than as John's challenge.
Yeah.
And because how many caregivers have shared with us that, the relational stakes of, when you're dealing with life and death matters every day with your caregiver, or when you get sleep deprived and you're going 24 hours and the cycle of everyday life is different than it is for your family and friends outside of your care experiences. The weekends mean something different to them, and they can't understand why you don't want to do something this weekend. And you want to text to them how you really think about the fact that they don't get your life, or you want to say something in that moment. But then you're kind of censored by the fact that if I say this, what does this do for my relationship going forward? I care about them. I don't want to excoriate them. And so it's this tension, and it kind of binds us down over time. It's exhausting. Mm-hmm. In ways that the stranger that your sister talked about doesn't, because there's no pre-existing relationship there.
That's right.
And then finally, one challenge of our pre-existing friend and family network is that, wow, we can be severely disappointed, not only by what is done and what is said, but by what is not done and what is not said. And this is almost impossible to explain to our family and friends. How do you explain, yeah, but you didn't call. Yeah, but you didn't ask. Yeah, but you didn't get it. Yeah, I had to tell you this for the 20th time. Typically, we absorb and digest this on our own because we don't have the language to explain what isn't happening, as well as what did happen.
It's true. And, it makes me think, Zachary, of someone I heard recently talked about the idea that a transaction of care, of giving and receiving, could be called a clean transaction. It doesn't come with all the baggage so if somebody you don't know doesn't call it, or very well, there would be no pre-existing expectation there. But if they leave a bag, if they leave dinner on the doorstep, That's a clean transaction. I don't even feel like it's okay if I thank them in a text tomorrow, because they won't be expecting me to talk for an hour on the phone with a detailed update of symptom management, etc. And I think often what we really need is a series of clean transactions, but from our family, and we need a way to communicate that that this would be helpful. What is it that we need exactly?
It's just a great way of describing it. And it is inevitable when these kinds of qualities exist to at times feel lost and alone, surrounded by people who once provided you so much comfort and solace. And that is one of those paradoxes of these transactions that you're talking about, in that whereas pre-caregiving, you felt so at home with your friends and family. They were everything you wanted them to be and more. And then all of a sudden, it's as if you're around strangers, even though they are not different, but you are changing. And, most of us focus in on the what's wrong with me when we feel alone. It's much harder to get to the space of understanding maybe I am evolving and my needs for my network are changing. And so, we have that chapter about that sense of betrayal, that we don't want to betray our friends and family. And we feel like it's a real act of betrayal by enlarging and expanding our networks. But Donna and I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the advantages of expanding your network so it enhances your relationships with your existing friends and family. It's not an either or, it's an and expansion that complements so much of what you can give to yourself and the kinds of support that you might interpret from those that you know best.